Welcome to Comedic Minds. We're opening up the files today on a really critical topic. We're looking at a political blueprint, one that's, well, incredibly detailed and so sweeping in its goals that, honestly, just its existence demands our attention right now. We're talking about Project 2025. It's this huge collection of policy proposals really aiming for radical systemic changes across the entire federal government. But, what makes this urgent today is the analysis that came out in October 2024 from the Legal Defense Fund, the LDF. They don't frame this 900-plus page document as just, abstract ideas. No, they see it as something much more immediate, more tactical. The LDF actually calls it a, quote, battle plan, so audaciously revealed to its targets.
Yeah, that phrase, audaciously revealed, it really hits home, doesn't it? It, strips away all the polite political talk. The LDF's assessment, and we've really been digging into this, is that Project 2025 poses a, and this is their wording, direct, boundless, pregnant threat to the interest and well-being of Black people and our democracy. So for us, I think that means we really need to look past the sort of political back and forth and focus purely on the mechanics. What are the proposed policy changes? And what could those mechanics mean for communities, especially those who've historically relied on federal protections?
Exactly. That urgency is why we're doing this. Yep. And before we really unpack the LDS analysis, please, if you're listening, take a second now, hit that like button, click the bell notifications too, so you get updates right away when we drop new material. And definitely subscribe to Comedic Minds for all our future insights. We're navigating some, let's say, exceptionally complex stuff today. So let's just start by laying out the essential background.
Okay, so first, what is this document? Project 2025. It's massive. We're talking 30 chapters, over 900 pages. It was published by the Heritage Foundation starting back in 2023. And the LDF, in their analysis, they consistently call it a radical extremist playbook. The whole idea behind it is that it's supposed to be ready to go, like on day one of a potential new administration.
Right. And if you had to boil down all those 900 pages,
right,
what's the central idea? What's the engine driving this whole thing?
Well, its core goal, really, is this unprecedented consolidation of power within the executive branch. Specifically, it aims to concentrate federal decision-making authority just in the office of the president. The policies are designed to significantly weaken the constitutional checks and balances that, we normally rely on. The LDF, and other critics too, they warn that this kind of concentration of federal power in just one person's hands, it really puts basic rule of law principles at risk. I mean, it suggests that the president could potentially act with much less regard for laws passed by Congress or even decisions from the Supreme Court. It's kind of trying to turn the federal bureaucracy into just a political tool for the president.
Okay, and that's where the LDF comes in, right? They bring this crucial historical perspective. For listeners who might not be familiar, the LDF, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, it's really the leading law organization fighting for the rights and dignity of Black communities. It goes way back, founded by Thurgood Marshall himself in 1940.
Yeah.
His whole purpose then was to dismantle Jim Crow.
And that history, that's absolutely key to how they're looking at this now. The LDF sees the tactics proposed in Project 2025 not as something totally new or out of the blue. No, they see it following what they call a well-worn playbook. They draw direct lines to historical efforts that were designed to, quote, target core democratic and constitutional principles and structures. And the purpose, historically and now, they argue, is to advance exclusion and racial caste. They really view this as a very intentional effort to, quote, turn back the clock and erase the hard-won progress of Black people over, the last 80 years or so.
It really sets up this idea of a systemic conflict.
Yeah.
The LDF report, it's called Attack on Our Power and Dignity. It lays out 7 major areas where Project 2025 poses a threat. So we'll use that as our guide today. Those areas are civil rights, education, political participation, that includes the census, public safety, and the criminal legal system, housing, healthcare productive rights, and environmental protections.
Yeah, and the key thing, and we really need to stress this for you listening, is how systemic they argue this threat is. It's not just isolated issues. The harm in one area seems meticulously designed, actually, to reinforce harm in another. Like, if you stop collecting data on police misconduct, right? That makes it almost impossible maybe to argue for equitable housing funding, because often that funding depends on proving disparities exist. It's like a closed loop they're describing.
Okay, let's dive into that first pillar then, civil rights. The LDF says Project 2025 really goes after the very tools we use to identify, prove, and prosecute discrimination. And it starts, like you said, with data.
That's exactly right. The first big action item here is stopping federal agencies, like the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, from collecting workforce race and gender data. This specific data, it's called EEO1 data. It's really the backbone of how the federal government monitors employment compliance.
Okay, but why is that specific information so fundamental? What does it actually do?
Well, the LDF emphasizes that collecting this data is essential because it provides the statistical evidence. It makes it harder for employers to hide discrimination, whether it's based on race or gender. It lets enforcement agencies see patterns, right, and trigger investigations into companies that might be breaking the law. So if you eliminate the ability to even track racial disparities in the workplace, you effectively make those disparities invisible. And if they're invisible, well, you can't fix them legally or through policy.
And this connects directly to the federal workforce itself, doesn't it? Which for a long time has been a major source of middle-class jobs for Black Americans. The proposals specifically call for getting rid of DEIA programs, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility.
Yes, exactly. And that's combined with this, frankly, dramatic proposal to strip job protections from potentially 50,000 career federal employees. They plan to do this using an administrative change called Schedule F. See, right now, most federal employees have civil service protections. They're supposed to be nonpartisan experts. Schedule F basically proposes reclassifying many of these roles as policy determining, which means they could be easily fired and replaced by political appointees loyal to the president.
Now, wait a second. Schedule F, that sounds like it would cause administrative chaos. Are they really talking about firing 50,000 people almost immediately? I mean, how do they even justify that level of disruption? And what's the specific impact on Black federal employees?
Well, the justification usually given is that the current civil service is seen as resistant or even hostile to the president's agenda. They want loyalty. The racial impact, though, is potentially devastating. Historically, Black workers found more opportunity and job security within the federal government civil service structure than in many parts of the private sector. So getting rid of DEIA programs and making thousands of career professionals, many of whom are Black, vulnerable to political firing, it doesn't just weaken the government's ability to enforce civil rights, it actively takes away a really critical source of stable, middle-class employment for the Black community.
Okay, so they attack the workforce composition and the data used to monitor it. But maybe the biggest legal change proposed here is Project 2025's push to eliminate disparate impact claims across the board: employment, education, housing, contracting.
This is huge. It's truly monumental, and, you really need to understand a bit of civil rights history here. Disparate impact is the legal tool that lets us address systemic bias, or hidden bias. Even if a policy looks neutral on the surface, its foundation really goes back to an LDF case from 1971, Griggs v. Duke Power Company.
Right. Refresh our memory on Griggs. What was the key issue there?
Okay, so in Griggs, Duke Power started requiring a high school diploma or passing scores on 2 general aptitude tests for basically any job, even manual labor jobs, or for transfers within the company. These requirements had the effect of screening out Black applicants at a much higher rate, and crucially, the company couldn't prove these requirements had any connection to actual job performance for those roles. The Supreme Court said, look, federal law isn't just violated by obvious intentional discrimination, what lawyers call disparate treatment. It's also violated by practices that are, quote, fair in form, but discriminatory in operation. Policies that seem neutral, but actually create barriers.
Ah, okay. So, if a company today uses some fancy hiring algorithm that seems objective, but it consistently filters out qualified applicants from, say, historically Black colleges, even if that wasn't the intent, that could be challenged using disparate impact.
Exactly. That's precisely what disparate impact is designed for. It's the tool meant to fight subtle bias, unconscious prejudice, or discrimination that's been cleverly disguised behind neutral policies in the modern era. The LDF is really stressing that if Project 2025 succeeds in eliminating disparate impact claims, then rooting out modern forms of discrimination where people have gotten much better at hiding their motives becomes incredibly difficult, almost impossible maybe. It essentially guts a core part of modern civil rights law.
And then there's this final piece in the civil rights section, something the LDF calls the weaponization of civil rights enforcement. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's quite a twist. The proposal directs the EEOC to actually limit its investigations into traditional race and gender discrimination claims, the very things that make up the vast majority of complaints they receive. But instead, it pushes the DOJ and the EEOC to actively investigate and prosecute entities, state, local, private companies that do have policies aimed at advancing racial equity. Things like specific DEIA training programs or setting goals for diversity in hiring. The LDF report says this is basically turning civil rights enforcement on its head, using the agencies created to fight discrimination to actually target organizations that are trying to promote equity, #2, threats to education and economic mobility.
Okay, so moving from the federal workforce and how rights are enforced, let's turn to education. The threats here feel really fundamental. I mean, the first proposal is just dismantling the Department of Education entirely.
That's the big structural piece, yeah. Project 2025 explicitly calls for abolishing the Federal Department of Education. Now remember, this is the main federal agency responsible for enforcing civil rights in schools, think Title VI protections against race discrimination, and also for administering billions in federal education funding. The LDF argues that getting rid of the ED throws the whole system into chaos, basically leaving enforcement up to state and local bodies, which historically have often failed to protect Black students adequately.
Let's trace that down to the student level. First off, school discipline. If disparate impact liability is gone, like we just discussed, how does that play out practically for Black students in schools?
Well, it essentially ties the federal government's hands when it comes to challenging discriminatory discipline practices. The data is really consistent and troubling here. Black students consistently receive harsher discipline, more suspensions, more expulsions, often for very subjective reasons like defiance or disruptive behavior, compared to white students for the same actions. These disciplinary actions push kids out of the classroom, often setting them on a path towards the criminal legal system. That's the whole school-to-prison pipeline concept. So if the federal government losing the tool of disparate impact to challenge a school policy that seems neutral but has these harmful, racially skewed outcomes, that pipeline just gets wider and faster.
Wow. Okay, second area, early childhood education. The plan wants to eliminate Head Start, which is huge for school readiness, and instead prioritize home-based care.
Head Start is incredibly important. Just recently, it served over 800,000 kids and families, and Black children made up almost 30% of those participants. The LDF points to clear research showing the benefits. Black children who go through preschool programs like Head Start performed, on average, 17 percentage points higher on cognitive tests compared to those who didn't get that early start. Eliminating this program wouldn't just hurt kids' learning outcomes directly, widening those early achievement gaps. It would also impact parents' ability to work, especially Black women who rely heavily on Head Start for affordable, quality childcare.
And beyond Head Start, the main strategy for K-12 seems to be pushing funds away from public schools through school choice.
Yeah, Project 2025 really doubles down on expanding things like school vouchers and education savings accounts, or ESAs. The LDF's argument is that these policies basically divert taxpayer money away from public schools and funnel it towards private institutions. These are often religious schools, they might lack transparency, they don't always have the same accountability standards, and crucially, they may not even have to follow federal civil rights laws. This tends to increase school segregation, both by race and class, and it makes existing resource gaps between wealthy and poor districts even worse.
And those resource gaps are already pretty stark, right?
Oh, absolutely. We have hard data on this. African American students are already 3.5 times more likely than white students to be in districts that are classified as chronically underfunded. And the LDF makes a striking point. 8 out of the 10 most underfunded states in the country have already adopted significant school voucher policies. So these programs are effectively draining funds from the public schools that are already struggling the most, ensuring that the students who need the most resources, who are disproportionately Black and brown, actually get less. It deepens the divide.
And finally, under education, there's this massive threat to economic mobility through the student debt crisis. Project 2025 wants to privatize student loans and get rid of programs like loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment plans.
Yeah, this is seen as a direct hit on the ability of Black graduates especially to build any kind of generational wealth. Here's the reality. Black students often have to borrow more money to attend college in the first place, and then, because of the persistent racial wage gap, they tend to earn less than their white peers after graduation, making it harder to pay back those loans. Nearly 60% of Black undergrads rely on Pell Grants, indicating high financial need, and Black women specifically carry the heaviest student loan burdens. Something like 43% of Black women who attended college have significant debt. For many, income-driven repayment, or IDR, is the only thing keeping them from defaulting. Project 2025's plan, get rid of forgiveness, push loans back to private lenders with less accountability, makes it exponentially harder for Black graduates to reach milestones like buying a home. And homeownership, as we know, is historically the main way families in America build and pass down wealth. So this blocks that path. Hashtag 3, risks to voting rights and political power.
So if the education system is being targeted, we also have to look at how Project 2025 goes after the very mechanism that's supposed to guarantee fair political representation, the Census Bureau. The plan seems to be to radically politicize this agency that's meant to be nonpartisan.
This is a really major structural threat they identify. Project 2025 proposes merging the Census Bureau with two other key data agencies, the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But the critical part is the staffing change. It calls for replacing the nonpartisan career civil servants who run these agencies with, quote, strong political leadership and political appointees. The LDF argues that the Census Bureau's reputation for independence and scientific integrity is absolutely vital. It's what encourages public cooperation, which you need to get an accurate count. And that accurate count is the foundation for enforcing voting rights.
Okay, so what are the practical, real-world consequences if the census count does become politicized and less accurate?
Well, the number one danger is making the undercount of certain communities even worse. We already know Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities are historically undercounted. Black people were undercounted by about 3.3% in the 2020 census alone. Why does that matter so much? Because census data determines how over $675 billion in federal funds gets distributed each year. For everything Medicaid, Head Start, infrastructure like highways, an undercount means communities don't get their fair share of funding for essential services. And just as importantly, it shifts political power. Congressional seats are apportioned based on census counts, so an undercount literally reduces representation for Black communities.
And we've seen fights over manipulating the census before, specifically with the push for a citizenship question. Project 2025 brings that back.
It does, yeah. The LDF report reminds us of the history here. The Supreme Court previously blocked the addition of a citizenship question, finding that the administration's stated reason, claiming it was needed to enforce the Voting Rights Act, was basically a pretext, not the real reason. The real concern, which the LDF absolutely shares, is that adding a citizenship question is actually intended to gather data that could be used for political gerrymandering, specifically drawing districts that favor white voters. The LDF warns that just proposing this question again will likely discourage participation from immigrant communities, Black people, and other people of color, which further skews the count and weakens their political voice.
Okay, so beyond messing with the count itself, the document seems to signal a really big shift in how voting rights are enforced by the federal government. It talks about moving election-related cases from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division over to its Criminal Division.
Right, and that shift sounds bureaucratic, but it's hugely significant in terms of focus and philosophy. The Civil Rights Division's voting section, historically, has focused on removing barriers that stop people from voting, things like discriminatory voter ID laws, illegal purges of voter rolls, polling place closures, moving election enforcement to the Criminal Division. That signals a shift towards criminalizing the act of voting itself, focusing on prosecuting individual voters for alleged fraud. The LDF argues this will inevitably create a chilling effect, making people afraid to vote, especially people with past felony convictions who often face confusing and changing rules about their eligibility. And we know Black voters are disproportionately in that group.
The LDF report points to that Florida example as a kind of preview of this approach, right?
Yeah, it's a really stark illustration of what can happen. After the 2020 election in Florida, you had these high-profile arrests of 19 residents for supposed voter fraud. 15 of those 19 people were Black. And many of them said they were explicitly told by state or local officials that they were eligible to vote. They thought they were following the rules. Project 2025's focus on prosecuting election crimes rather than protecting access seems to amplify this punitive approach. It disproportionately targets Black adults, the LDF notes 1 in 19 500s. Black adults nationally are disenfranchised due to felony convictions, a rate 3.5 times higher than non-Black individuals. This focus on criminalization just makes that worse. Hashtag 5 for 4, counterproductive public safety and criminal justice proposals.
All right, let's shift gears to public safety. The LDF report goes into detail about how Project 2025 aims to use the Department of Justice to push these really punitive, racially biased strategies, the kind that historically drove mass incarceration in Black communities.
Yeah, and perhaps the most extreme policy proposal here is the push to expand the federal death penalty. Project 2025 explicitly calls on the DOJ to do everything possible to execute everyone currently on federal death row, and it wants to expand the list of federal crimes eligible for capital punishment. This is being pushed despite, overwhelming evidence of deep racial bias in how the death penalty is applied in the U.S.
The LDF uses a really specific, powerful story to illustrate that bias, don't they?
They do. It's the case of Buck v. Davis concerning Dwayne Buck in Texas. During the sentencing phase of his trial back in 1997, a psychologist testified under oath that Mr. Buck was statistically more likely to commit future acts of violence because he is Black. The prosecutor then explicitly used that testimony to argue for the death sentence. Now, the Supreme Court eventually ruled this was ineffective assistance of counsel, but the case just lays bare how explicit racial bias can infect capital cases, and the overall numbers reflect this systemic issue. Black people make up about 13–14% of the U.S. population, but they're drastically overrepresented on death row, 38.1% on federal death row, and over 40% on state death rows.
Wow. Okay, next, Project 2025 wants to get rid of a major tool that's been used to address widespread police misconduct: consent decrees.
Right. Consent decrees are these legally binding agreements enforced by a court that are worked out between the Department of Justice and local police departments or cities. They typically happen after a DOJ investigation finds a pattern or practice of systemic civil rights violations by the police department. They mandate specific reforms. Essentially, they're the federal government's strongest tool for forcing reform on police departments engaged in unlawful conduct. So Project 2025's call to terminate their use basically removes that key federal accountability mechanism.
And we have examples showing that these decrees, when implemented, can actually lead to measurable changes, right?
Absolutely. The LDF report specifically highlights Ferguson, Missouri. Remember, a consent decree was put in place there after the DOJ investigation following the killing of Michael Brown. The data shows that under the court-mandated reforms between 2014 and 2023, there was a staggering 91.8% drop in the number of tickets issued by police and a 95.3% drop in the number of arrest warrants issued. That's pretty clear evidence that the decree was effective in curbing the kind of racially disparate policing practices like excessive ticketing just to generate revenue that had been targeting Black residents. Ending consent decrees would let those practices continue unchecked.
The document also pushes for more punitive measures generally, like bringing back mandatory minimum sentences.
Yes, this feels like a clear throwback to the policies of the 80s and 90s that really exploded the prison population. Mandatory minimums force judges to impose fixed, often very long sentences for certain crimes, regardless of the individual circumstances of the case or the person. We have data from just 2017 to 2021 showing the clear racial impact. Black men, on average, received federal sentences that were 13.4% longer than white men convicted of the exact same crime. The LDF argues that mandatory minimums just make these disparities worse. They disproportionately lengthen sentences for Black individuals without any real evidence that they actually make communities safer.
And finally, in this section, there are proposals that the LDF warns could actually increase hate violence.
Yeah, Project 2025 promotes things like aggressive immigration enforcement, potentially reviving policies like the controversial China Initiative, which targeted researchers of Chinese descent. The LDF warns that this kind of government rhetoric, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, has historically correlated with documented spikes in hate crimes against various minority groups, including anti-Black hate crimes. They point to the horrific mass shooting in Buffalo, where the shooter explicitly cited racist replacement theory ideas as a tragic example of how dangerous rhetoric, especially when it seems to be echoed or legitimized by government actions, can fuel deadly violence. #V, healthcare at risk, reproductive rights.
Okay, let's turn to healthcare and specifically reproductive rights. This is incredibly critical, especially given the tragic reality that Black pregnant people already face maternal mortality rates roughly 3 times higher than white women. Yeah. How does Project 2025 potentially make this crisis even worse?
Well, it seeks to ban, or at the very least, severely restrict abortion access using several different legal strategies at once. This disproportionately impacts Black communities because, as the LDF notes, Black women account for about 42% of those seeking abortion care in the U.S. When access gets restricted, maybe forcing people to travel hundreds of miles, take more time off work, wait longer for appointments, Black pregnant individuals are put at even greater risk for bad health outcomes, including death, because they're already navigating a healthcare system with existing structural inequities.
Let's look at medication abortion first, since that's how the majority of abortions happen now in the U.S.
Right. Project 2025 specifically targets mifepristone, one of the 2 drugs typically used. It suggests the FDA should just reverse its approval entirely. But even short of that, as an immediate step, it proposes reinstating older pre-2016 dispensing requirements. This would bring back medically unnecessary rules requiring the drug to be dispensed in person by a certified provider. That makes it much, much harder, maybe impossible, for people in rural areas or underserved urban areas to get the medication.
And there's this really striking proposal to ban the mailing of abortion pills altogether, based on a law from 1873, the Comstock Act. What even is that, and why is an 1873 law suddenly relevant?
Yeah, the Comstock Act. It's this old, somewhat obscure 19th century law originally aimed at suppressing obscenity and immoral materials. It made it illegal to send certain things through the U.S. mail. Crucially, the law explicitly listed any article or thing designed, adapted, or intended for producing abortion as among the banned items. Now, that part of the law has basically been dormant since Roe v. Wade in the 70s, but Project 2025 proposes that the Department of Justice and HHS should immediately start interpreting the Comstock Act as legally prohibiting the mailing of any substance used for abortion, including mifepristone and misoprostol. If that interpretation were enforced, it could act like a nationwide ban on medication abortion, potentially even impacting procedural abortion if supplies can't be mailed. And it could happen without Congress ever passing a new federal ban.
That is, wow. A really aggressive legal strategy, basically reviving a Reconstruction-era law. Okay, beyond medication, Project 2025 also tries to undermine emergency abortion care in hospitals.
Yes, by pushing for a very, very narrow interpretation of EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. EMTALA is the federal law that requires hospitals receiving Medicare funds to provide stabilizing emergency care to anyone who comes in, regardless of their ability to pay. Project 2025 asserts that EMTALA, quote, requires no abortions, preempts no pro-life state laws, essentially arguing that states can ban abortion even when it's necessary to save the pregnant patient's life in an emergency. This interpretation would allow hospitals, or force hospitals in some states, to deny necessary emergency abortion care, further endangering the lives of pregnant people, especially Black women who already face the highest maternal mortality risks.
And lastly here, the LDF report warns about the potential creation of abortion surveillance systems. What would that involve?
Project 2025 suggests that the Department of Health and Human Services should collect really detailed data on everyone seeking abortion care, things like the precise gestational age, the state where the person lives, maybe even the reasons for seeking care. The LDF warns this creates a severe risk of increased criminal scrutiny and contact for pregnant people, particularly Black pregnant people. History shows that when pregnant women have faced arrest or forced medical interventions related to their pregnancies, they have overwhelmingly been low-income women, and Black women have been disproportionately targeted. So, increased government surveillance combined with multiplying restrictions directly raises the threat of criminalization for Black women simply trying to manage their reproductive health.
And we can't ignore the economic fallout from these restrictions either.
Absolutely not. The LDF points out research suggesting that Black women actually see about a 7% increase in their employment opportunities in places where abortion access is protected. When care is denied, it often leads to increased financial burdens, higher medical costs, lost wages from being unable to work, the cost of raising an additional child unexpectedly. This directly impacts economic security and widens the racial wealth gap as families struggle more with basic needs like food and housing. #, environmental justice.
Okay, let's move to environmental justice. It's such a critical piece of the LDS analysis, but maybe one that doesn't always get the spotlight it deserves. The LDF warns Project 2025 specifically targets environmental protections for Black communities that are already dealing with long-standing environmental racism.
Yeah, the core attack strategy here is dismantling oversight. Project 2025 aims to completely eliminate the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. And beyond that specific office, it calls for dramatically shrinking the overall size, budget, and enforcement capacity of the EPA itself. Functionally, the LDF argues, this is like the federal government deciding to just turn a blind eye to these persistent, systemic environmental hazards that disproportionately harm certain communities.
So what are the specific on-the-ground consequences if EPA enforcement is weakened like this, especially for Black communities?
Well, the LDF report details how Black communities face disproportionate exposure on multiple fronts. Let's take air quality. Research consistently shows Black people have the highest average exposure levels to air pollution from pretty much every major source, type industrial plants, power plants, vehicle traffic. You know, historically, city planners often deliberately routed highways through Black neighborhoods or zoned industrial facilities right next to them. This long-term sustained exposure leads directly to higher rates of asthma, heart disease, lung cancer. So if you reduce EPA enforcement, these high-polluting facilities basically face less pressure, less accountability from the federal level.
And water contamination is just as serious and disproportionately affects Black households, too.
Yeah.
Precisely. Data shows that water systems serving predominantly Black communities are significantly more likely to have contamination issues, whether it's lead from old pipes, bacteria, or dangerous forever chemicals like PFAS. The LDF also notes a stark statistic. Black households are twice as likely as white households to lack complete plumbing, just basic infrastructure. This comes from decades of disinvestment in infrastructure in majority Black neighborhoods. They inherently bear more risk when it comes to water quality. If the federal government, through the EPA, steps back from enforcement, it basically just locks in that existing injustice. It makes the next Flint water crisis or something similar feel almost inevitable.
And finally, climate change resilience is also targeted, with the plan pushing for more fossil fuels.
Right. Project 2025 aims to essentially halt federal investments in climate solutions, prioritize expanding fossil fuel production, natural gas, coal, and get rid of environmental reviews that can slow down those projects. The immediate physical impact is clear. The LDF notes over 6.7 million Black residents currently live in the 91 U.S. counties that have oil refineries. They are already on the front lines bearing the health consequences of that pollution, plus climate impacts like increased flooding and extreme heat waves. Furthermore, the plan wants to shift the financial responsibility for disaster relief FEMA's emergency spending away from the federal government and onto state and local governments, which are often already struggling financially. Given FEMA's own documented history of providing disaster relief funds inequitably, particularly to Black communities after events like Hurricane Katrina, pushing responsibility down to the states risks denying critical aid even further, especially in states with governments that might be indifferent or even hostile. #tag7, housing and intergenerational wealth.
Okay, that brings us to the final pillar, housing. This is so fundamental for family stability and building wealth. Project 2025 seems to target fair housing rules and assistance programs in ways that could directly worsen the racial homeownership gap.
It follows that same pattern we saw earlier in civil rights. The first step is to attack the ability to even measure the problem. Project 2025 wants to block the collection of racial data related to housing access and disparities. It also aims to end federal support for fair housing testing. That's the practice where organizations use testers, like match pairs of prospective renters or buyers who differ only by race, to see if landlords or real estate agents are discriminating. If you can't measure discrimination, who's getting denied loans, who's getting steered away from certain neighborhoods, who's not being shown available apartments, then you can't effectively enforce the Fair Housing Act.
And just like with the Department of Education, they also propose dismantling the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, at least as we know it.
Yeah, the proposal is to transfer many of HUD's enforcement responsibilities down to state and local governments. This essentially guts HUD's federal oversight power. The LDF argues this creates a really dangerous patchwork system where discrimination can flourish, potentially through policies like so-called crime-free housing ordinances. These ordinances often encourage or even require landlords to evict or refuse to rent to anyone who's had any contact with the criminal legal system, even just an arrest, not necessarily a conviction. Given the racial disparities in policing and arrests we already talked about, these policies overwhelmingly end up excluding Black tenants and their families.
They also seem to be promoting housing policies that have a really long, troubling history connected to racial exclusion.
Yes, that's a key point. Project 2025 explicitly encourages investments only in single-family zoning. Now, that might sound neutral, maybe even desirable to some, but historically, single-family zoning was one of the main tools used in the mid-20th century after explicit racial zoning was outlawed to keep Black families out of white neighborhoods. It effectively locked them out of areas with better-funded schools and higher property values. The LDF sees promoting this model today without addressing its exclusionary legacy as basically reinforcing segregation and suppressing the potential for property value growth in Black communities.
What about help for renters? Programs like Section 8 housing vouchers are absolutely crucial for stability for so many families.
Project 2025 proposes dramatic cuts to investment in Section 8 and other rental assistance programs. This is a huge threat because Black households are significantly overrepresented among families relying on subsidized housing. They also face disproportionately high rates of eviction filings already, so cutting back on this support would almost certainly lead to a sharp rise in housing instability and homelessness. The LDF provides the context. Black people already make up about 37% of the U.S. homeless population, despite being only around 14% of the overall population. These proposed cuts would guarantee making that crisis much, much worse.
And then finally, homeownership, the main engine for building intergenerational wealth in America. The plan seems designed to make that harder, widening the existing racial gap.
That's certainly the conclusion from the LDF and other housing advocates. Project 2025 proposes policies that would restrict access to homeownership. Things like increasing costs, for example, raising mortgage insurance premiums, and cutting back on support programs, like down payment assistance initiatives. We know that decades of discriminatory practices, from government-sponsored redlining in the past to ongoing predatory lending, have created this enormous racial homeownership gap between Black and white families. So by making homeownership more expensive and harder to achieve, especially for first-time buyers, Project 2025 would actively block the main pathway for Black families to build equity and pass wealth down to the next generation. It essentially locks in the racial wealth gap for potentially decades more.
Wow. Okay, we've covered these 7 critical areas: civil rights, education, voting, justice system, health, environment, housing. It's a lot. When you step back and look at all these proposals together, what's the single unifying strategy that the LDF report really pulls out?
Yeah, it's pretty clear when you lay it all out. The LDF basically identifies this unified, kind of two-pronged strategy running through everything. First, there's this direct assault on the very foundations, the legal and statistical tools of civil rights enforcement. They go after data collection everywhere, the census, employment stats, housing data, and they aim to eliminate the disparate impact standard, that key legal tool. The goal seems to be to make inequality invisible, statistically speaking, and therefore legally impossible to challenge or fix. The second prong is dismantling the nonpartisan expert civil service through things like Schedule F. This ensures that even if a future administration wanted to enforce civil rights laws robustly, the institutional knowledge and capacity to do so would be severely damaged, maybe even gone.
So it creates this kind of closed loop, a self-reinforcing cycle where harm in one area feeds harm in another.
Exactly. That's the systemic nature they emphasize.
Yeah.
You erode the accuracy of the census data, right? That directly leads to underfunding for schools and housing programs in Black communities. That underfunding reinforces the environmental hazards those communities face. Then you eliminate disparate impact, making it impossible to challenge discriminatory school discipline or hiring practices that result from those underfunded systems. That lack of opportunity contributes to disparities in the criminal legal system, which then leads to voter disenfranchisement, reducing political power. The LDF really frames it as this comprehensive structural assault on the very possibility of a functioning multiracial democracy.
And the LDF makes a point of emphasizing that this isn't just about morality or social justice, but that there's a cold, hard economic argument here, too.
That's a really crucial takeaway for you, the listener, I think. The LDF cites this stunning figure. Since the year 2000, the U.S. economy has potentially lost something like $16 trillion in GDP, just due to the economic effects of the racial inequality gap. Things like lost wages, reduced educational attainment, lack of opportunity. So closing these gaps, it's not just the right thing to do. The LDF argues it's actually an economic necessity for the prosperity of the entire country, for our competitiveness on the global stage.
So faced with what the LDF describes as this pregnant threat, what's their final message? What's their vision for resisting this and moving forward?
Well, the message is definitely one of resolve, not despair. They conclude the report by saying, as alarming as the threat of Project 2025 is, it does not have to be our destiny. So the response isn't just defensive. It's not just about stopping bad things. It's about articulating an affirmative vision, a vision for a society where everyone's dignity is sacred, where power is genuinely shared. And they back this up with specific alternative strategies. Like in public safety, instead of just more policing, the LDF advocates for investing in things like trained, unarmed civilian Riddle-Bonder Corps to handle routine calls, mental health crises, minor disputes that don't actually require an armed police officer. It shows there are other paths toward effective, equitable, and more humane ways to ensure community safety. So their overall vision is about proactively building political power, defending the rights that Black communities have fought so hard for, and ensuring that progress isn't just protected, but actually expanded upon. done.
That really brings us to the end of our deep dive today into the LDF's comprehensive and frankly sobering report on Project 2025. This is exactly the kind of critical, detailed information that needs to be understood more widely. So if you found this discussion valuable, if it gave you something to think about, please make sure you hit that like button right now. Click the bell for notifications so you don't miss our updates. And most importantly, please subscribe to Comedic Minds for all our future analysis. Your engagement really helps us keep these vital conversations going.
And maybe as you reflect on everything we've discussed today, particularly that Unified Strategy Project 2025 seems to employ targeting almost every way we measure and address inequality, maybe consider this question. If the ability to gather unbiased, accurate data about racial disparities truly is the most critical tool we have for enforcing civil rights, then what existing structures or institutions, maybe ones outside the federal government, do we absolutely need to rely on, support, and maybe even proactively fund to maintain that essential function of accountability regardless of who holds political power?